In the 15th and 16th centuries, the Ottoman Empire stood at the gates of Central Europe, its armies victorious, its logistics intact, its enemies fragmented. The Balkan kingdoms were broken. Hungary was exposed. Vienna was no longer unthinkable. And yet, again and again, the Ottomans stopped. They did not annihilate their enemies. They did not erase them from the map. They allowed weakened states to survive, fractured, exhausted, and permanently unstable. Why? Why would an empire at the height of its power refuse to finish the war? Why would commanders deliberately leave hostile regimes alive, knowing they could recover? And why did this decision, so counterintuitive, so dangerous, appear not once, but as a recurring strategic pattern? Because this was not hesitation. It was not mercy. And it was not a failure of nerve. It was a form of warfare designed not to end conflict, but to prolong decay. And that choice carried a cost few historians are willing to confront. This documentary is not about Ottoman battles, siege timelines, or lists of victories. It is about a strategic decision that violates one of the oldest assumptions in warfare: that the purpose of war is decisive destruction. The Ottomans repeatedly chose non-annihilation when annihilation was possible. They halted advances not because they were weak, but because continuing would have created a different, and in their view, more dangerous, problem. The strategic question is not whether the Ottomans could have destroyed their enemies. It is why they calculated that doing so would be worse. This was a gamble rooted in systems thinking. Logistics over glory. Political friction over territorial expansion. Managed instability over absolute control. A strategy that assumed an enemy kept alive, but weakened, could be more useful than one eliminated outright. But such a strategy only works if every assumption holds. If one fails, the entire structure collapses. And that is where this story truly begins. Because to understand why the Ottomans stopped, we must first understand the constraints that made total victory a trap. To understand why the Ottoman Empire repeatedly chose not to annihilate its enemies, we must first discard the simplified map most people carry in their heads. This was not a binary contest between Ottomans versus Europe. It was a fragmented, unstable system stretching from the Adriatic to the Hungarian plain, filled with half-collapsed kingdoms, rival dynasties, religious fault lines, and overlapping claims of authority. The Ottomans were not confronting a single enemy. They were confronting a strategic ecosystem. A fractured opposition, not a unified front. By the late medieval and early modern period, the Balkans and Central Europe were politically brittle. Local kingdoms were weakened by dynastic succession crises, internal noble rivalries, religious divisions between Catholic, Orthodox, and emerging Protestant powers, competing obligations to external patrons. Hungary, Wallachia, Serbia, and their neighbors did not function as a coherent defensive bloc. They functioned as adjacent stress zones, each with its own internal fractures. From a purely military perspective, this looked like an invitation. Fragmentation usually signals opportunity. It suggests that a decisive campaign could roll forward, collapsing resistance node by node. But fragmentation also produces something else: unpredictable cascades. Destroy one power center completely, and you do not get stability. You create a vacuum. And vacuums, in this system, were rarely neutral. The real adversary: distance and sustainment. The Ottoman heartland lay far from Central Europe. Every advance northward lengthened supply lines, stretched administrative control, and increased dependency on seasonal movement. This was not a modern army operating on permanent rail and industrial logistics. Campaigns were bounded by weather, harvest cycles, road conditions, animal endurance. Conquest beyond a certain depth did not increase power proportionally. It increased friction. Every additional province required garrisons, administrators, tax enforcement, conflict mediation. The Ottomans understood something that battlefield-focused histories often miss. Territory does not become power the moment it is conquered. It becomes a liability first. And in regions with strong local identities and foreign religious alignment, that liability matured slowly, often violently. Political ceilings, not military ones. Militarily, Ottoman forces were capable of sustained offensive operations. Politically, however, expansion faced ceilings. A fully conquered Central European territory would not exist in isolation. It would immediately attract attention from the Habsburgs, the papacy, rival Muslim powers watching imperial overextension. Total victory would not end conflict. It would reframe it at a higher level, drawing in actors with deeper resources and longer strategic horizons. In other words, annihilation risked escalation. Partial dominance did not. Allowing weakened states to survive created buffers. Zones that absorbed pressure, delayed coalition formation, and fragmented response. From Istanbul, a semi-independent, unstable neighbor was often preferable to a fully occupied province that triggered continental resistance. The hidden danger of success. Complete military success carries a paradox. It removes the constraints that previously limited your behavior. As long as an enemy exists, strategy remains cautious. Once an enemy is erased, hubris enters the system. Ottoman decision-makers were acutely aware of this risk. Rapid expansion had already created internal strains. Competition among elites. Administrative overload. Disputes over spoils and appointments. Each new conquest intensified these tensions. A campaign that stopped short. That achieved dominance without total absorption. Kept internal equilibrium intact. Victory was calibrated, not maximized. Time as a strategic resource. Perhaps the most underappreciated constraint was time. Ottoman leadership did not think in campaign cycles alone. They thought in generational arcs. A weakened enemy forced to rebuild institutions, suppress internal dissent, negotiate legitimacy. Was an enemy investing time inward, not outward? Time spent stabilizing was time not spent coordinating alliances. As long as neighboring states remained in recovery mode, the Ottomans controlled the tempo. Decisive annihilation would have reset the clock, inviting immediate, focused resistance from larger powers. The enemy's blind spot. From the perspective of European powers, the Ottomans appeared inconsistent. Why stop when victory was near? Why withdraw instead of consolidate? This behavior was often interpreted as indecision, overextension fears, internal weakness. What opponents failed to see was that they were being left alive on purpose. The Ottomans were not reacting to enemy behavior. They were shaping it. A weakened but sovereign state behaves differently from an occupied one. It polices itself. It taxes itself. It suppresses rebellion internally. All without costing the empire manpower. From a systems perspective, this was efficient. From a moral perspective, it was deeply unsettling. The constraint that matters most. All of these factors, logistics, politics, distance, time, fed into a single overriding constraint. The Ottoman Empire could win battles faster than it could digest victories. And when digestion fails, empires poison themselves. Stopping was not an absence of ambition. It was an attempt to avoid systemic overload. But this raises an uncomfortable question. If total victory was a trap, what did orthodox military doctrine actually demand? And why would following it have led the Ottomans toward strategic failure rather than success? Because to understand that contradiction, we must examine what correct warfare was supposed to look like, and why it did not work here. Military doctrine exists to reduce uncertainty. It offers commanders a framework, a way to act decisively when information is incomplete and pressure is absolute. But doctrine is built on assumptions. And in this theater, those assumptions quietly collapsed. What correct warfare looked like. In the late medieval and early modern world, orthodox strategy followed a familiar logic. Identify the enemy's center of power. Destroy its army in the field. Seize its capital or dynastic core. Eliminate its ability to reorganize. Victory was defined as irreversibility. A war was considered unfinished as long as the enemy retained sovereign authority, a standing elite, control over taxation and legitimacy. Anything less than total collapse was viewed as a temporary condition. From this perspective, stopping early was irrational. It violated the principle of momentum. It invited resurgence. Most commanders were trained to fear one thing above all else: the enemy that survives. Why doctrine appeared irresistible? Doctrine did not persist because it was simplistic. It persisted because it usually worked. Decisive destruction. Simplified political aftermaths. Reduced ambiguity. Allowed clear claims of success. For commanders operating under intense scrutiny, both from rulers and from history, doctrine offered protection. If the campaign failed, responsibility could be shared with the rulebook. Deviation, by contrast, personalized risk. A commander who chose restraint over annihilation carried full ownership of the outcome. If the enemy recovered, there would be no doctrinal cover. The hidden flaw in doctrinal thinking. What doctrine failed to account for was system load. It treated conquest as a discrete event, not a cumulative process. It assumed that once territory was taken, its integration would follow automatically. In reality, integration consumed more resources than conquest. Every destroyed regime had to be replaced with administrators, garrisons, legal frameworks, religious accommodations. Doctrine optimized for battlefield clarity, not imperial sustainability. The Ottomans were confronting a problem doctrine did not name. At what point does continued success degrade the system that produced it? Why applying doctrine here led to failure? In the Balkan Central European context, annihilation produced cascading consequences. Destroy one state completely, and you force the empire to assume responsibility for border security, mediate local power struggles, absorb hostile populations with external loyalties. Each conquest increased exposure rather than reducing it. Doctrine assumed that removing enemies reduced threats. In this environment, it multiplied them. Worse, annihilation clarified intent. A fully absorbed territory sent an unmistakable signal to other powers. This was not containment, this was expansion without limit. That signal accelerated coalition building. Restraint, by contrast, blurred intentions. A weakened but sovereign neighbor suggested a limited objective. It bought ambiguity. The doctrinal fear that proved misplaced. Traditional strategy warned against leaving enemies alive because of one risk: revenge. The Ottomans calculated that this risk was overstated. A defeated but sovereign state did not immediately seek retaliation. It sought survival. Its priorities shifted inward. Rebuilding legitimacy. Controlling elites. Preventing fragmentation. External aggression became secondary. Doctrine assumed that survival and resistance were synonymous. Ottoman decision-makers observed that survival often meant compliance, delay, and dependency. This was not idealism. It was observation. Why most commanders could not see this? Seeing the limits of doctrine required a different kind of literacy. Not battlefield literacy, but administrative foresight. Most military leaders rose through combat success. They were rewarded for decisive action, not long-term equilibrium. Their incentives favored visible outcomes. Ottoman leadership, especially at the imperial center, operated under a broader calculus. Taxation over trophies. Stability over spectacle. Time over closure. This did not make them immune to doctrinal thinking. It made them selectively disobedient to it. The contradiction at the heart of the decision. Here lies the paradox. If the Ottomans followed doctrine, they risked internal overload, external escalation, administrative collapse. If they rejected doctrine, they risked enemy recovery, accusations of weakness, long-term insecurity. There was no safe choice. The decision to stop was not a rejection of warfare. It was a rejection of warfare as doctrine defined it. But rejecting doctrine does not eliminate risk. It concentrates it. Which leads to the most critical question of all. If this strategy violated every instinct taught to commanders, how did it ever gain approval? Who proposed it? Who resisted it? And what assumptions were strong enough to justify such exposure? Because the moment doctrine was set aside, decision-making entered its most dangerous phase. Unorthodox strategies are rarely born from inspiration. They emerge from pressure, when every orthodox option produces unacceptable consequences. This decision was no exception. There was no single architect. One of the most persistent myths in military history is the idea of a lone strategic genius overturning convention in a single stroke. That is not what happened here. The Ottoman choice to halt rather than annihilate did not originate as a manifesto. It emerged incrementally, through repeated confrontations with the same structural limits. Commanders rotated. Campaigns changed. Enemies shifted. But the constraints did not. Each advance north reinforced the same pattern. Success created obligations. Obligations generated resistance. Resistance consumed administrative capacity. Over time, the imperial center began to recognize a recurring asymmetry. The army could move faster than the state could absorb. That realization did not come from theory. It came from friction. The internal fault line. Inside the Ottoman decision-making structure, the debate did not divide neatly between hawks and doves. It divided along institutional perspective. Field commanders favored continuation. They saw opportunity through the lens of momentum. Administrative elites saw danger. They tracked taxation, unrest, and long-term control. Neither side was irrational. They were optimizing for different failure modes. Military leadership feared the enemy's recovery. The central authority feared imperial indigestion. The decision to stop was not consensus-driven. It was a compromise enforced by system limits. The assumptions that made restraint thinkable. For such a strategy to be approved, even tacitly, several assumptions had to be accepted as true. None of them were guaranteed. First assumption: fragmentation would persist. Ottoman planners assumed that their enemies would remain divided. Not permanently, but long enough. They believed internal rivalries, religious divides, and succession disputes would prevent rapid consolidation. This was not blind optimism. It was pattern recognition. But it was still a gamble. Second assumption: fear would outweigh ambition. A weakened state, spared annihilation, might choose defiance. The Ottomans assumed most would choose survival instead. They bet that fear of renewed invasion would suppress offensive planning, encourage accommodation, delay alliance formation. If that fear diminished, the entire strategy unraveled. Third assumption: external powers would hesitate. By stopping short of total conquest, the empire projected ambiguity. Ottoman leadership assumed this ambiguity would slow external intervention. Not eliminate it, delay it. Time was the currency. If larger powers interpreted restraint as weakness rather than calculation, escalation would accelerate instead of stall. This assumption was the most fragile. What this strategy was actually targeting. Despite appearances, this was not a strategy aimed primarily at territory. It was aimed at behavior. The objective was to shape how neighboring states acted over time. Inward-facing governance. Defensive postures. Reactive diplomacy. The Ottomans were not trying to eliminate enemies. They were trying to fix them in a position. A position where rebuilding consumed resources. Legitimacy crises distracted leadership. Autonomy existed, but initiative did not. This required a precise balance. Too much pressure, and the enemy collapses, forcing absorption. Too little, and the enemy recovers, reorients, and resists. The decision to stop was not a retreat. It was calibration. Why this was strategically reckless? From a doctrinal standpoint, this choice bordered on negligence. It violated the principle of closure. It accepted long-term exposure. Every year an enemy survived was another year of uncertainty. The Ottomans were effectively saying, "We believe we understand the system better than the system understands itself." That is a dangerous belief. Because systems adapt. And when they do, strategies built on static assumptions fail catastrophically. The political risk no one wanted to own. Approving restraint meant accepting a future where failure would be gradual, ambiguous, and hard to attribute. There would be no single moment of collapse. Only accumulation. This created a unique political risk. If annihilation failed, blame was immediate. If restraint failed, blame was delayed and diffuse. Delayed blame is harder to defend. It erodes legitimacy silently. Those who supported this approach were betting not only on enemy behavior, but on their own successors maintaining the same discipline. That continuity could not be guaranteed. Why the decision held, temporarily. Despite all this, the strategy persisted. Not because it was comfortable, but because alternatives looked worse. Total conquest threatened system overload. Total withdrawal threatened loss of influence. Restraint offered a narrow corridor between collapse and escalation. It was not chosen because it was safe. It was chosen because it was the least catastrophic option available. But choosing such a strategy is only the beginning. Designing it is one thing. Executing it, without letting it unravel, is another entirely. Because once restraint becomes policy, every action must be measured. Every misstep becomes amplified. And every enemy reaction matters more than before. Which brings us to the most fragile phase of all, implementation. Because the moment this strategy moved from theory into reality, it became vulnerable to failure at every level. Designing a strategy of restraint is intellectually difficult. Executing it is structurally dangerous. Because restraint does not reduce operational complexity. It multiplies it. From concept to practice. Once the Ottomans chose not to annihilate their enemies, they entered an unfamiliar operational space. This was no longer a campaign with a clear terminal objective. It became an open-ended management problem. Military force still had to be applied, but selectively. Pressure had to be maintained, but never maximized. Threat had to remain credible, but never decisive. Every campaign now had to answer a different question. How much violence is enough? That question has no stable answer. The mechanics of controlled pressure. Operationally, restraint required constant adjustment. Too little pressure invited recovery. Too much pressure forced collapse. The empire had to conduct punitive campaigns without permanent occupation. Enforce submission without dismantling local authority. Project strength while signaling limits. This demanded a level of coordination rarely acknowledged in traditional military analysis. Field commanders could no longer pursue total victory instinctively. They had to stop, often against their own training. That alone introduced friction. Logistics did not disappear, they changed form. Restraint is often misinterpreted as economy. It is not. The Ottomans did not save resources by stopping short. They reallocated them. Instead of sustaining deep occupation, they sustained repeated mobilization, forward readiness, constant intelligence gathering. Armies still had to be assembled. Supply lines still had to function. But now there was no final drawdown. The empire paid not in spikes, but in chronic expenditure. A standing posture of readiness is more corrosive than a single decisive push. The invisible logistical burden. One of the least examined aspects of this strategy is fatigue. Not battlefield exhaustion, but systemic fatigue. Troops were mobilized repeatedly without closure. Commanders rotated through unresolved theaters. Administrators governed border regions where nothing ever truly ended. There was Northwest Victory Parade. No clear demobilization point. Over time, this eroded discipline. Restraint demands patience. Armies are not built for patience. The risk of miscalculation. In a doctrine of annihilation, mistakes are often absorbed by momentum. In a doctrine of restraint, mistakes accumulate. A single misjudgment. One campaign that pushes too far or pulls back too early can shift the entire balance. If a local ruler collapses unexpectedly, the Ottomans must decide. Absorb territory they did not plan to govern, or allow chaos to spread along their border. Neither option fits the original strategy. Restraint removes margin for error. Intelligence becomes existential. In this system, intelligence is no longer supportive. It is decisive. The empire must constantly assess how close an enemy is to recovery, whether alliances are forming, when fear is turning into resolve. But intelligence is never complete. Signals arrive late. Intentions are ambiguous. Local actors manipulate information. A strategy that depends on precise calibration is dangerously exposed to noise. Micro-twist, the danger of success. Ironically, the strategy was most vulnerable when it appeared to work. A weakened enemy that stabilizes internally can become quietly resilient. Reforms begin. Institutions consolidate. External diplomacy resumes. From the Ottoman perspective, everything still looks calm. But calm is not submission. It is preparation. Restraint can lull decision-makers into mistaking silence for compliance. Micro-twist, internal incentives break alignment. Another destabilizing factor was incentive misalignment. Field commanders were rewarded for visible success. Restraint produced ambiguous outcomes. This created pressure to exaggerate threats, justify renewed campaigns, push beyond intended limits. Each such deviation chipped away at the strategy's coherence. A doctrine that relies on discipline must constantly fight the incentives of those tasked with executing it. The structural contradiction. At its core, this strategy asked the empire to behave against its own nature. Empires expand. They consolidate. They seek closure. Restraint demanded perpetual incompletion. That is not a stable equilibrium. The Ottomans were attempting to hold a system at a precise level of instability. Unstable enough to suppress opposition. Stable enough to avoid absorption. This is extraordinarily hard to maintain over decades. The quiet accumulation of risk. None of these risks caused immediate failure. That is precisely why they were dangerous. There was no single moment of collapse. Only gradual erosion. Each campaign adjusted slightly too far. Each intelligence estimate carried a margin of error. Each internal compromise diluted discipline. Over time, the system drifted. And when drift occurs in a strategy built on calibration, recovery is not simple. Because the moment the balance breaks, it breaks fast. Which leads to the final question of execution. How did the enemy respond? Not how they fought, but how they misread what was happening. Because this strategy only worked as long as opponents misunderstood it. The success of a strategy of restraint depends on a single, fragile condition. The enemy must interpret restraint incorrectly. If they see it for what it is, the strategy collapses. For a long time, they did not. What the enemy thought they were seeing. From the perspective of Balkan and Central European powers, Ottoman behavior appeared inconsistent. Campaigns were devastating, but incomplete. Victories were decisive, but not final. Pressure arrived, then receded. To many observers, this looked like limitation. They interpreted Ottoman pauses as logistical exhaustion, political distraction, internal instability, overextension. In short, they saw constraint, not calculation. This interpretation shaped everything that followed. Doctrinal blinders at work. European military thinking at the time was heavily outcome-oriented. Victory meant conquest. Failure meant retreat. There was little conceptual space for deliberate incompletion. When the Ottomans stopped, opponents assumed the empire had reached its limit. That assumption rested on doctrine, not evidence. Doctrine taught them that no rational power would leave an enemy alive by choice. Therefore, survival was read as opportunity. The fatal misreading. Instead of asking why the Ottomans stopped, many states asked how long they could exploit the pause. They redirected attention inward. Consolidating authority. Suppressing rivals. Negotiating legitimacy. This was rational behavior, but it played directly into Ottoman expectations. A state focused on self-repair is a state not preparing coordinated resistance. The Ottomans did not need immediate submission. They needed delay. And delay is exactly what their enemies chose. Fragmentation reinforces itself. Another critical misreading concerned regional dynamics. Each surviving state assumed others would bear the cost of resistance. This created a diffusion of responsibility. Why escalate if your neighbor remains neutral? Why provoke when the empire is not advancing? The Ottomans benefited from this hesitation. Restraint fragmented threat perception. No single state felt compelled to act decisively. Because none believed the danger was immediate. The illusion of autonomy. Restraint preserved sovereignty, but hollowed it. Surviving states retained symbols of independence. Rulers. Courts. Diplomacy. But their strategic freedom narrowed. Every major decision had to account for Ottoman reaction. This created a paradox. They were independent enough to be responsible for their own stability, but constrained enough to avoid bold moves. Many leaders mistook this for equilibrium. It was not. It was managed vulnerability. Where the enemy's logic failed, the core error was linear thinking. Opponents assumed, if the Ottomans did not destroy us today, they will be weaker tomorrow. They failed to consider a third option. That restraint could be a sustained position, not a temporary pause. They also underestimated the empire's tolerance for uncertainty. They believed the Ottomans required closure as much as they did. That assumption was wrong. When the misreading began to crack, over time, signs appeared that something was off. Pressure returned with uncanny precision. Campaigns resumed exactly when recovery crossed certain thresholds. Rebellions were punished, not annexed. Borders shifted, but only partially. This pattern suggested intent. But by the time some leaders began to suspect calculation, their options were limited. Internal resources had been consumed. Alliances were delayed. Momentum was lost. Restraint had already shaped behavior. The structural disadvantage of late recognition. Recognizing a strategy late is worse than never recognizing it at all. Once enemies understood that survival itself was being used against them, reversing course was difficult. Coordination required trust. Trust required time. Time was exactly what the Ottomans had been stealing. The enemy did not fall because they were deceived by a clever trick. They fell because their decision-making framework could not process deliberate restraint. The deeper irony. The Ottomans did not win because they were unpredictable. They won because they were predictable in a way doctrine could not interpret. They applied pressure consistently, but stopped short consistently. Consistency without closure is destabilizing. It keeps opponents guessing without giving them a clear threshold to respond to. But this advantage was temporary. No misreading lasts forever. As generations passed, as institutions adapted, as information circulated, the fog lifted. Eventually, restraint was no longer mistaken for weakness. It was recognized as control. And once recognized, it provoked a different response. One that no longer played into Ottoman assumptions. Which brings us to the unavoidable reckoning. Because every strategy that manipulates decay eventually has to face its consequences. And the price of prolonging instability is never paid only by the enemy. Measured purely by short-term outcomes, the strategy appeared to work. The Ottoman Empire avoided overextension. It delayed large-scale coalition responses. It preserved flexibility while maintaining dominance along its frontiers. But strategy cannot be judged only by what it prevents. It must also be judged by what it creates over time. And over time, this strategy generated costs that were neither immediate nor evenly distributed. The visible outcome. In the near term, restraint achieved its core objectives. Neighboring states remained divided. No unified counterweight emerged quickly. Ottoman forces retained the initiative, choosing when and where to apply pressure. From a distance, this looked like control. But control achieved through prolonged instability is fundamentally different from control achieved through consolidation. One produces order. The other produces managed disorder. And disorder has a habit of spreading inward. The human cost, conflict without resolution. For populations living in these buffer zones, restraint did not mean peace. It meant uncertainty. Wars did not end. They paused. Raids, reprisals, and punitive campaigns recurred. Authority shifted without stabilizing. Generations lived under the assumption that violence could return at any moment. Because it often did. This kind of conflict does not produce dramatic casualty spikes. It produces persistent attrition. Families displaced repeatedly. Economies unable to recover fully. Local elites locked in cycles of dependency and fear. The empire did not absorb these populations. But it also did not release them from war. The logistical cost, readiness without relief. A strategy of restraint demands constant readiness. For the Ottomans, this meant maintaining forces near borders indefinitely. Funding repeated mobilizations. Sustaining intelligence networks without pause. There was no demobilization dividend. Resources were not exhausted in one decisive push, but drained slowly. This type of expenditure is harder to justify, harder to measure, and harder to reform. Because it never feels urgent. It simply never ends. The political cost, ambiguity becomes liability. Initially, ambiguity was an asset. It delayed external intervention. It softened perceptions of imperial ambition. But over time, ambiguity became difficult to sustain. As restraint repeated itself, patterns emerged. External powers began to recognize that survival was conditional. That sovereignty existed, but under constraint. Once this logic became clear, restraint no longer reduced escalation risk. It invited coordination. The very states that had once hesitated now had a shared understanding of the threat. Ambiguity works only while it confuses. Once it clarifies, it unites opposition. The internal cost, discipline under erosion. Perhaps the most dangerous cost was internal. This strategy required sustained discipline across generations of leadership. But empires do not renew incentives automatically. Field commanders still sought decisive victories. Administrators still feared disorder. Political elites still competed for influence. Over time, alignment frayed. Some campaigns pushed too far. Others pulled back too early. The coherent logic of restraint fragmented into inconsistent practice. And inconsistency is fatal to strategies built on calibration. The psychological cost, leadership without closure. For those at the center of decision-making, restraint imposed a unique burden. There was no final victory to secure legitimacy. No moment when risk could be declared resolved. Every decision carried forward uncertainty. Was the enemy still weak enough? Had fear turned into planning? Was this pause still calculated, or had it become habit? This kind of leadership is exhausting. It demands constant vigilance without reward. And vigilance, when sustained too long, gives way to either complacency or overreaction. Both are dangerous. If the strategy had failed outright, it is important to confront the counterfactual. Had a single assumption collapsed early? Had an enemy consolidated faster than expected? Had an external power intervened sooner? Had internal discipline broken decisively? The consequences would have been severe. The empire would have faced a recovered enemy without having eliminated them. Delayed consolidation without having secured territory. Escalation without preparation. Restraint concentrates risk. When it fails asymmetrically. The delayed reckoning. In the long arc of history, the Ottoman Empire did not collapse because it practiced restraint. But restraint contributed to a strategic environment where enemies learned to adapt. Coalitions became more sophisticated. Internal flexibility eroded. What began as a method of avoiding overreach gradually limited the empire's ability to respond decisively when conditions changed. The strategy did not cause decline. But it shaped the form that decline took. Gradual. Contested. Prolonged. The uncomfortable conclusion. This strategy cannot be categorized as success or failure in simple terms. It succeeded at what it aimed to do, temporarily. But it did so by trading short-term stability for long-term entanglement. It avoided collapse by postponing resolution. And postponement is not neutral. It accumulates interest. Which brings us to the final task. Not to judge the Ottomans, but to understand what this strategy actually teaches us about power, control, and the danger of managing decay. Because the real lesson of this strategy lies not in what it achieved, but in what it reveals about the limits of strategic restraint. At first glance, the Ottoman choice not to annihilate its enemies looks like a historical curiosity. A deviation. An anomaly. It was neither. This strategy was not about mercy, hesitation, or missed opportunity. It was about a different definition of control. This was not a war strategy. It was a system strategy. Most military doctrines treat war as a problem to be solved. Victory is the solution. Defeat is the failure. The Ottoman approach treated war as a condition to be managed. The objective was not resolution. It was regulation. Enemies were not variables to eliminate. They were components within a broader system, components whose behavior could be shaped by pressure, fear, and uncertainty. This is the first principle this strategy exposes. Power does not always seek closure. Sometimes, it seeks equilibrium. The rule it broke. The most fundamental rule this strategy violated was the assumption that decisive destruction produces lasting security. Ottoman restraint suggested the opposite. Decisive destruction can produce obligations that weaken the victor more than the defeated. This reframes victory itself as a potential liability. It forces a harder question. At what point does winning begin to undermine the system that enables you to win? This question is rarely asked in military education, because it has no clean answer. The hidden logic beneath restraint. What made this strategy viable, temporarily, was not strength alone. It was asymmetry of tolerance. The Ottomans demonstrated a higher tolerance for prolonged uncertainty, unresolved borders, ambiguous outcomes. Their opponents sought clarity, finality, stability through resolution. This asymmetry created advantage. Restraint works when one side is willing to live with risk longer than the other. But this is not a permanent advantage. Why this strategy is so difficult to replicate? On paper, restraint looks elegant. In practice, it is brutal. To sustain it, a power must possess centralized authority strong enough to suppress internal dissent, administrative capacity to monitor slow-moving threats, political culture that accepts delayed outcomes. Most states lack at least one of these. Restraint demands discipline without reward. That is an unnatural posture for most political systems. This is why the strategy appears rarely and collapses easily. The moral discomfort it creates. There is a reason historians often avoid framing this as deliberate design. Because it forces an uncomfortable realization. This strategy prolonged suffering intentionally. It did not end wars. It kept them unresolved. Stability was achieved not by peace, but by managed vulnerability. This complicates any attempt to portray it as enlightened or humane. It was efficient. It was calculated. And it was cold. The strategic paradox at its core. Restraint relies on enemies remaining predictable. But predictability erodes as systems adapt. Over time, opponents learn to coordinate, to reform institutions, to reinterpret survival as preparation. When that happens, restraint loses its leverage. What once delayed escalation begins to provoke it. The strategy contains its own expiration date. Not because it stops working tactically, but because it teaches others how to defeat it. The real lesson. This strategy does not teach us how to win wars. It teaches us something more unsettling. Power can be exercised by refusing to end conflict. But doing so always transfers cost forward. That cost accumulates in human lives lived without closure, institutions stretched by permanent readiness, leaders burdened by unresolved risk. Eventually, someone pays. The only question is who and when. Why this matters beyond the Ottoman case. This pattern did not disappear with empires. Modern powers still face the same temptation. To weaken without destroying. To destabilize without occupying. To manage threats rather than resolve them. The logic feels familiar because it is. But the Ottoman experience offers a warning. Managing decay is not the same as controlling it. And systems held in deliberate imbalance eventually push back. Which brings us to the final closing thought. The Ottoman Empire did not fail because it refused to annihilate its enemies. It survived, longer than many of its rivals, precisely because it understood the danger of winning too much, too fast. But survival achieved through restraint is not the same as stability achieved through resolution. By choosing not to finish wars, the empire postponed decisions that could not be postponed forever. Every enemy left alive carried forward uncertainty. Every border left unresolved demanded vigilance. Every pause required justification. For a time, this worked. Because the Ottomans were willing to accept what others could not. Unfinished outcomes, blurred victories, and permanent risk. But history does not reward tolerance indefinitely. Eventually, the environment changes. Opponents adapt. Internal discipline weakens. Ambiguity hardens into opposition. At that point, restraint stops being strategy and becomes inertia. This is the final, uncomfortable truth of this case. There are moments when not finishing the war is the most dangerous decision of all. Not because it is weak, but because it demands perfection over time. And no system, imperial or modern, can sustain perfection indefinitely. Power that manages decay must eventually confront it. That confrontation is never clean, never cheap, and never optional.